So I wanted to make a video with my thoughts on Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. As a Borderlands fan, I was excited for this release, but I tempered my expectations knowing that this wasn't meant to be the next big Borderlands release. I just thought it'd be fun to talk about what I thought about the game's features and how they stack up against my expectations. I'll structure this ramble quite simply. We'll just talk about the main features one at a time, and I'll say what I like about them, say what I don't like about them, until we get to the very end. So the most important thing with a shooter, in my mind, any shooter, is the mechanics, more specifically the movement and shooting mechanics. The good thing is about Wonderlands is that these are essentially unchanged from Borderlands 3, so you'll get the same smooth experience of killing enemies and maneuvering around the environments from Borderlands 3. There isn't really much to talk about this. It's just good. Next, you have navigating the game world. So you have the overworld, which is just kind of a way of getting around the story. I have almost no criticisms here, as it is just a solid, fun way of navigating through the story. My only criticism, along with other people's, is that the combat encounters can be annoying. They're just little dudes that run at you in the tall grass, and while you can just hit them away and avoid them altogether, they're just kind of annoying. But once you have finished the overworld, it becomes obsolete, which is a good thing, because I would imagine navigating the overworld in the endgame would get kind of old. So instead you can just fast travel around the different maps that you've unlocked. Speaking of the maps are very well made. They're diverse in terms of environments, and they're big too, which is something that I wasn't expecting. But they kind of suffer from the same problem that Borderlands 3's maps did on release, where navigating through them can be kind of annoying sometimes without well-placed fast travel stations. While it may be kind of a petty complaint, it would make a world of difference for replayability, for me at least, if more of the fast travel stations were placed better, or just more of them existed in the first place, so I didn't have to traverse for so long to get to the boss I wanted to farm, or whatever it is within that map. In saying that, I would imagine that it isn't as much of a problem for other people, or maybe it's just a me thing. But overall, the navigation is pretty standard for a Borderlands game, and there's not really many complaints. So the next thing is the story, the side missions, and the writing in general. This is the part of any game that I'm least interested in for the most part. With a Borderlands game, I love the whole endgame gear grind and the looting part and the shooting part far more, but I can appreciate a good, fun, and well-written story. So in Wonderlands, the story is done well. Gearbox is, I would say, in their element here for the most part. Almost every part of the story is fantastical and nonsensical, and Gearbox kind of completely leans into that with the writing and how they lay out the story. The humor hits way more than Borderlands 3 did, and the overall writing is just way, way, way better. And this goes for the side content too. So the side missions are, some of them are ridiculous and well written. And it just makes me feel like this is the kind of context in which Gearbox was most comfortable writing a story and side missions in. So it's a big win in my book, and hopefully a step in the right direction for wherever they go with the next Wonderlands game. Alright, so let's talk about the levels, skills, and general progression. I'm a fan of progression in this game. At the start, you have one skill tree to choose from, and then after progressing through the story, you'll have another skill tree to choose from the 6 classes. This is good because it just opens up a ton of room for different OP builds to be made, and it's just a big positive for the game. On top of that, you get hero points per level up to add small percentages to things like dexterity and intelligence. I like the addition of these two. It's just another part of the progression, I suppose. There's not much to complain about when it comes to it. The max level is 40, but most of the skill points you get make a significant difference in your character's strength, so progression actually feels good. I know the number 40 might turn some people off, but the skills you add, as I said, actually make a pretty big difference in your character's strength. On top of that, you have your myth rank, and so this is just your version of badass rank. And I like the way they've done this time around. You put 1 point into a categorized tree, and then you can't add another point into that tree until you fully rotate around the 4 trees back to that tree. So it's just kind of a clock where you just put 1 point in per time, I guess. It's obviously a balance thing, so I don't mind it, and it adds a cool twist to badass rank, I suppose. But in general, I'm a fan of the progression in this game. It feels good. Alright, so let's talk about weapon and gear variety. In terms of gear, Gearbox has given us 2 ring slots and 1 necklace slot, so this goes along well with the whole fantasy theme, and then 1 armor slot, which is your class mod, 1 spell slot, and then 1 shield slot. I'd say this is pretty solid. 6 gear slots is pretty damn good, and it makes for more gear to grind for to min-max out your class, I suppose. And it's fun to try and get the perfect rolls on these items too. So gear variety gets an A+ in my book. I feel slightly differently about the weapon variety. While there are a lot of different guns in this game, as you would expect from a Borderlands game, for my initial playthrough, I felt like I was getting similar weapons over and over until I finally started to get legendaries with their own unique shot patterns and abilities and things. Part of me wishes there was more variety, as I've come to like it when every gun I pick up does something different to the last, but even when I'm at the end of my Chaos Chamber run and looting things from the bunnies, I feel like every weapon does something that I've seen before, and I'll even see the same legendaries over and over. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy the variety that does exist. It's a Borderlands game after all, there's going to be a ton of variety, but I just wish there was more. Alright, so let's talk about a loot and its drop rate balance. Coming from the abundance of legendaries that was Borderlands 3, one of the first things I noticed about Wonderlands was how scarce the legendaries were in comparison. The balance of loot in this game feels pretty damn good, at least for the early portions. Once you get into the end game, the loot luck mechanic really comes into play. You increase your loot luck through collecting loot dice and other means. So I'm now Chaos 35, which is the highest point of endgame at the moment, and the best way to describe the endgame loot drops would be inconsistent, I feel, in my opinion. Sometimes I feel lucky, and then other times I feel like I'm getting nothing. Despite this, I think the distribution of loot in Wonderlands is far better than handing out legendaries and good gear left, right, and center. The game almost feels like a real MMO where you have to run a boss more times than normal just to get that legendary drop with the perfect roll that you want. I'm still kind of undecided on this whole subject, but I definitely know that something doesn't feel right with specifically the endgame loot drops. The other note about endgame drops is that once you reach Chaos levels, you can start getting Chaotic gear. Once you reach Chaos 20, you can start to get Volatile gear. And once you reach Chaos 35, you can start to get Primordial gear. This is a system that needs some balancing, in my opinion. Basically, the higher the tier of gear, so Chaotic, Volatile, Primordial, the better percentage increase the stats on that weapon will have, the stats on that gear will have. But again, this feels inconsistent in between all the different types of gear. And because this seems inconsistent, that means the endgame difficulty can seem inconsistent too, which doesn't lead to the smoothest of endgame experiences. But they always have the chance to balance this out as the game hasn't been out for that long, and they have a chance to make the kind of endgame loot balance feel more consistent. Alright, let's talk about the bosses in Wonderlands. Boss variety is done very well in this game, I feel. There are a good amount of unique main and side bosses to kill, each with their own sometimes similar abilities and patterns, but overall they mostly feel unique. The look of the bosses is done great, and while the invulnerability phases of some of the bosses can get annoying, for the most part the pacing of the fights is done well, of course with the exception of the stupid shield regenerating bosses that get harder and harder towards the end game, but that's a topic for another time. But overall, I feel like bosses have been done pretty damn well in Wonderlands. I also feel like the variety in bosses and how they've done them in Wonderlands kind of surpassed my expectations. I wasn't expecting this level of detail or kind of grandeur in the bosses that do exist in the game. So in that category, they kind of exceeded my expectations. So the side content in Wonderlands is pretty solid. You have your collectibles, so on each map there's things like lost marbles, poetry pages, and of course the loot dice to collect. And on top of that you have one combat obelisk and a short time trial thing per map. I believe there are 40 side missions, which might sound small when you hear it, but it's a solid number when you're actually playing through the game. You also have your challenges that will give you XP. And overall, on my initial playthrough, I felt like there was a good amount of side content for me to get through and aim to complete, especially in my time after finishing the main story. So the side content mostly matched up with my expectations of quantity for side content. But of course, in a game like this, I still want more. I want more side quests. I want more collectibles. I want more variety in the side content. Even though I feel like they've done a good job this time around with the expectations for Wonderlands, I still want more. Alright, so let's talk about the endgame content in Wonderlands. Endgame in Wonderlands is a mixed bag for me. While you can run through old bosses that you fought and do the combat obelisks over and over again, and I'm sure that you'll take time to collect all the loot dice around the map, the main endgame content is the Chaos Chamber, which is a Wonderlands version of a roguelike. It's an endlessly repeatable dungeon where at the end of it, you'll fight a random main boss from throughout the game, and then you'll enter a room with a chest and a bunch of loot bunnies where you'll get your loot. This is a cool concept, but I only found myself wanting to grind through the Chaos Trials to increase my Chaos level, and after those were completed, my desire to run the Chaos Chamber kind of ran out. It is fun and it's good to see Gearbox experimenting, but for me it got old very quickly. The modifiers you'll find within the run don't fully work for me either. I find the harder modifiers to be more annoying than challenging, and the easier modifiers, I don't know why they exist, really. There are also bosses at the end of the run that need some reworks, but you won't always get those, and I'm sure the bosses that do need reworks will eventually get them. Once you complete a run, however, you get to the best part of the chamber, the loot bunnies. This is where you give your essence that you earned in the run to one of the loot bunnies for a specific reward. You can choose between every single piece of gear and gun category in the game, and I really like this, and it's super rewarding if you get one of those runs where you just feel lucky. And as I said before, the loot can feel inconsistent, so sometimes after a 20 to 30 minute run, you'll leave the loot bunnies without changing a single piece of gear or getting a single upgrade. This is one of the reasons the endgame got quite stale for me, as doing the chamber over and over again by itself can get boring, but once the looting part becomes boring too, it's just not a good combination. My expectations were definitely surpassed with the Chaos Chamber, as I didn't expect something like this to exist in the game in the first place, but parts of the game need rebalancing and reworks to make the Chaos Chamber even more replayable. It is an important note, however, that the Chaos Chamber puts you in scenarios where you're only experiencing the best of a Borderlands game, which is the looting and the shooting, but as I said, parts of the game need balancing to make that an even smoother experience so that you can continue to enjoy the things that Borderlands does right. Alright, so my final thoughts on the game. The early portions of Wonderlands are really fun. The story is good, the gameplay is solid, and the loot is very well balanced and an enjoyable mechanic. However, the game gets very grindy and repetitive without much substance to keep that repetition fun very quickly. Repetition is a good thing, of course, but there needs to be enough substance and variety to back it up. The lack of variety isn't something I would mind personally if the endgame balancing was better, but ultimately I feel like there needs to be changes in how Wonderland's endgame operates to make that a smoother experience. So, would I recommend Wonderlands? Well, if you're a casual or a new Borderlands player, I'd still highly recommend Wonderlands. It's one of the better Borderlands games in a while, and I feel like I definitely skimmed over the parts of this game that did well, and focused on criticizing the parts they've done wrong, but I guess it's just easier to talk about the bad than to properly praise the good for whatever reason. If I had to give it a rating, I'd probably give it a 7.5 to an 8 based on my expectations. And overall, I think this is a good step in the right direction for the Borderlands franchise. I appreciate everyone watching. Again, this is a super bare bones video. I just want to practice talking more and reading off a script and not reading off a script, and being able to articulate myself well into a microphone and to a camera while this video doesn't have a camera. But yeah, I appreciate you watching, and yeah, see you later.